Hey guys, so today I'm doing the more detailed video on the neutrinos at Fermilab. I said I would do this in the main Fermilab video, so here it is, the detailed neutrino video. So I'm just going to go through everything they told me basically about the neutrinos in probably order of the beam. So the beam comes off of the booster or the main injector, I don't remember, one of the two. It gets passed through a carbon. This beam is very energetic at this point. Like 8 GeV, I think. So it's a very high energy, pretty high energy beam. It gets passed through a graphite plate or a graphite block, basically. And these are protons. Sorry, passing through this graphite block. And these protons, basically, they will turn in after they pass through the graphite block. They create pions and kaons, I believe. And since the protons were going straight, the pions and the kaons are going to continue to go in a basically straight line. And so then they go through a tube that is backfilled with helium, and they basically vacuum. They had the tube under a vacuum for a while, but since this is a very large tube, they said, oh, it's pretty dangerous to have this under a vacuum, because this isn't like a small, tiny tube, like where the protons would go around through for like Tevatron or the LH. This is a large tube. So they said, well, we don't really want to have this under a vacuum. So they just, after they had vacuumed it out and had it under a vacuum for a while, they backfilled it with helium. And helium, because it's, it's so small that you have a very low probability of one of the pions or kaons actually hitting part of the helium, and not hydrogen, because hydrogen is explosive and helium is not explosive. So very safe to fill this tunnel with helium, and almost just as effective as filling with a vacuum. So these pions and kaons go through the tunnel, and they decay into neutrinos and a bunch of other stuff. So at this point, they have a block, basically a steel block, and then this beam, which by this point, the pions and kaons have decayed into mostly neutrinos and some other particles, pass through this block. All the other particles, since this block is a very dense block of steel, rocks, earth, whatever, all the other particles will hit the atoms or the electrons in this steel and earth, and they'll bounce off and decay. While the neutrinos, most of them will just go right through. And so then they basically, at that point, they end the tunnel, and the neutrinos go through solid rock. I apologize if I don't have pictures for all of this. I didn't get to go to this part of the neutrino experiment, and some parts of the experiment I just didn't take pictures. I was too busy with the tour, so I apologize for that. So at this point, the neutrinos are going right through the Earth, solid Earth, no tunnel. The tunnel has basically shifted the decay pipe, which you can access in an emergency. You can actually walk up the decay pipe, which is on a separate electrical system from the rest of the experiment, just for safety's sake. You can actually go through the decay pipe. So after basically right before the block, right before the decay pipe ends and the neutrinos start going through the ground, the decay pipe sort of angles down at a 15-degree angle, while the neutrinos are going down at a 3-degree angle. They angle this down so it can actually get deep down into the Sudan mine in Minnesota. It's a 3 degrees down. And so this pipe that is at a 15-degree angle is like an access pipe. It has no physics in it. It's more like an access pipe for the data and stuff to go through, and for people as well. And so you go down that and you get to the elevator shaft, and this is where I went down, is through this elevator shaft. And so you go, which is like 350, 320, 350 feet down at the bottom of this access pipe where it flattens out. And then you have the two experiments. You have the Minerva detector, which is the new one. You have that detector first, and you have the Minos detector, which is the old one, second. So after you walked through the elevator shaft, right, basically we walked back to the access tunnel, which is the 15-degree angle, and then we walked back around the elevator shaft and saw they've just drawn this circle in the wall where the neutrinos will be coming out of. And this neutrino beam, since neutrinos are neutral particles, you can't focus them. So the last point the beam actually gets focused is when it's still protons. So because of that, the neutrinos actually spread out and the beam becomes Gaussian. If you haven't watched this, Gaussian is sort of like the bell shape, like, you know, the Liberty Bell or something. It's sort of like that shape. So the beam is actually Gaussian, and so the beam is centered around this point. And at this point, the main Gaussian part is about 2 feet wide, but the edges extend beyond the cavern. And so they basically have this, and the neutrinos just come out through that circle they've drawn with spray paint in the wall, basically. And they pass through the Minerva detector, which is a new detector. And so the way these detectors work is they have steel plates, large horizontal steel plates. They're like hexagon or pentagon-shaped steel plates, very large, you know, maybe 2 stories, well, 1.5 stories large, but they're very wide as well, and they're an inch thick-ish. And they have a lot of these plates lined up. And so on these plates, the Minerva detector is a pretty small detector, but they have all these plates lined up, so, you know, not a very large amount of plates, but it gets the job done very well. And on these plates, they basically have this scintillator material, and so I'm not really sure what it is. I think it's just called scintillator. I'm not sure what it's made of exactly. But they basically have scintillator coming in from 3 different directions, so you can get different the different axes, so you can actually tell what's happening. And so what happens is, how these detectors work is when neutrinos actually go through the steel, sometimes, rarely, they interact with the steel and they form electron showers going through the steel, which is basically like one electron knocks off 2 electrons, so the electron shower gets exponentially larger. I'm pretty sure it gets exponentially larger, but, you know, it's like a chain reaction electron shower of electrons just getting knocked off of the atoms of the steel. And this works with steel because it's conductive and stuff, so you can have the electron flow. And so then this large electron shower, at this point it's a very large shower, reaches the end of the steel and it hits the scintillator material. This scintillator material will convert the electron shower into photons, into light. These photons will then pass out of the scintillator into what's called photomultiplier tubes, which basically use a series of increasing voltages to, or that's at least the ones I know how they work, but I'm not sure quite how these photomultiplier tubes work. But anyway, the electron, the light from the scintillator reaches the photomultiplier tubes, and then that light from the photomultiplier tubes gets read into a computer array, which then sends it back to the computers that do, you know, the work, basically. So, and they have 3 different scintillator, like I said, so they can see a sort of a 3-dimensional image of this electron shower, so they can identify the neutrinos. So then they have the scintillator in the 3 different places to see the different electron showers. The Minerva detector actually can distinguish, the main thing that sets this apart from the Neutrinos detector is that it can actually distinguish between the different types of neutrinos. It can distinguish between electron neutrinos and muon neutrinos. It can't tau neutrinos, but it can distinguish between an electron and muon, which is an advance in 10 years in technology, basically. So, and it also uses half the amount of computers that the Neutrinos detector is, just because of the advances in computer technology. So, as we walked away from that experiment, we basically walked to the 2nd level of the, then we walked up to the Neutrinos detector. The Neutrinos detector has a 2nd detector in the Sudan mine in Minnesota that tracks the events, basically, and they said they can, between the Neutrinos and Minerva near detectors, which is what they're called, the ones at Fermilab, and the Neutrinos far detector in the Sudan mine in Minnesota, they can actually correlate about 4 to 5 events per month, and after 10 years of doing this experiment, they have proved neutrino oscillation at Fermilab. So yes, neutrinos do oscillate. So, you know, despite the relatively small amount of data they're getting, you know, the very few events correlated, they can still, you know, figure out the oscillation of it. They can figure out the oscillation pretty well, actually. So that surprised me based on the small amount of data they're collecting. But anyway, the Neutrinos detector is much larger and has a lot of steel plates, but not all the plates have scintillator materials. If you're looking from one side, you'll see about every 5 to 6 plates have scintillator materials, which is that thin material next to the steel. But there's actually more scintillator than that. There's actually scintillator every 2 or 3. It's just because you're only seeing one of the axes, and like I said, they put the scintillator on 3 different places to get 3 different axes of the electron shower. And so the Neutrinos detector is much larger just because of these unused plates and because the older technology from Minerva, the Neutrinos detector. That's why it's larger, and it's very large, and it uses more computers just because the computers are 20 years old at this point, I think. That's really it for the neutrinos, but they're actually building, and then at that point the neutrino beam exits the wall, and I walked right through the beam, and I got pelted with neutrinos, which is really nothing special because standing near the sun you get pelted with neutrinos, but it was neat to know at least that they were muon neutrinos. So, I should mention that the Neutrinos detector can only detect muon neutrinos, not electron neutrinos, not tau neutrinos, and same thing with the far detector in the Sudan mine. So that's its main disadvantage over the Minerva detector, as well as being larger and yeah, pretty much, and having more computers. So what they're also doing is they're building this Nova detector, and like I said, this beam is Gaussian. It's not like a proton beam where it's very small, very thin, and can't focus. You can't focus neutral particles. So the beam is Gaussian, so the actual edges of the beam extend very far out. And at the center, the problem with the beam is that it has neutrinos of many different energies in the center, but towards the edges you get neutrinos collecting at a certain energy. So the closer you get to the sides of the Gaussian response, the more consistent the energy of the neutrinos is, which is great for these experiments. It benefits the experiments greatly. So this is what the Nova detector is detecting. It's like the neutrino off-axis something. But anyway, they're basically digging 350 feet below to build a cavern right next to where Minerva is. And so it's going to catch the edges of the beam, the Nova near detector is. And then they're placing the Nova far detector, they're placing that above ground and also slightly off to the side to catch the edge of this Gaussian-shaped beam. And they're placing it above ground just because it's cheaper and, to not dig the hole. Basically 90% of the, $500 million they spent on this experiment is, digging the hole, basically, which, it sounds kind of funny, right? They're not doing any physics digging the hole, but it was necessary to do the shielding, and they figured out that this wasn't actually necessary to dig the hole way down because they can already detect, they can already differentiate between neutrinos from the sun and other sources and neutrinos from their neutrino source that I mentioned how they make those neutrinos earlier. So really, that's not necessary anymore. So that's why they're putting the Nova detector above ground. It also lets them to capture, the side of the beam, like I said, because it's also slightly off axis. And so these Nova detectors also represent another 10-year leap in technology. So first you have the Neutrinos detector, and then the Minerva detector, and then the Nova detector, and they're separated all by about 10 years. And so the disadvantage with Neutrinos and Minerva is that they use steel plates, right? And so the steel is necessary to create the electron shower when a neutrino happens to interact with it. But things you can't see the electron shower inside the steel. You can only sense the electron shower inside the scintillator. And since most of the experiment isn't scintillator, it's actually air and steel, you get about 10%, right? You can actually sense 10% of the area for neutrinos, right? And the Nova detector, what it does instead is it uses a scintillator liquid. This means that the electron shower actually happens inside the scintillator instead of outside the scintillator and then gets passed in like it does in Neutrinos and Minerva. So when the electron shower happens inside the scintillator, you can get a much more detailed view, and you actually get 90% sensing area. So this Nova detector is full of this scintillator liquid, which sort of is very expensive, so it adds some of the cost that they've reduced by not using the steel plates and extra computers that they had to do, because again they're using less computers because of the advances in computing technology. And so these Nova detectors are full of this scintillator liquid, and they've actually built a prototype above ground, and it can actually also sense the edge of the neutrino beam, the very edge, but it can't sense it because the beam is very intense, the most intense neutrino beam in the world. And so it can actually sense the very edge even though it's above ground and off axis. They basically just put a building in this sort of new neutrino area, and it can sense it. But the thing is, that detector was having problems, so they're still debating, to my knowledge, as to whether to move that detector to the new hole that they're digging right off axis next, basically directly to the, if you're facing where the Sudan mine, directly to the left of the Minerva detector. So they're debating as to whether to move that one to that hole or whether to build a new one. And then they're also they're going to build a new one regardless, probably a replica or a very similar detector for the far Nova detector. And the Nova detector as well can sense between mu neutrinos and electron neutrinos, but to my knowledge it cannot sense tau neutrinos, which is a shame because we won't get to see as much detailed statistics on the tau. But you got to keep in mind that these detectors, however, even if they can sense, even if they had 100% sensing area, they're not going to sense many neutrinos because neutrinos really don't interact with matter all that much. So this really hampers their experiments. So now that I've spent all my time talking about the detectors, from the detectors, the neutrino beam is actually just slightly wider. At the very end of the Minos detector, which is the last detector in the cavern 350 feet below ground, the very end, the neutrino beam is actually slightly wider than steel plates. And I forgot to mention, these detectors are lined up with the neutrino beam incredibly accurately so that the neutrino beam passes as much as it possibly can through these detectors to maximize the amount of events that they see, because they would like to have more events correlated between the near and far detectors, which means they need more neutrinos to hit both of them, basically. So they do that, and so at the very last steel plate, the beam is actually several inches. The main part of the Gaussian beam is actually several inches wider than the last steel plate. So they also have put a circle at the very center of the Gaussian-shaped beam at the wall where the neutrinos leave. And obviously the fringes, the edges of the Gaussian beam at this point are very wide, but then the neutrinos basically go flying all the way to the Sudan mine in Minnesota, and on their flight path, they've timed it so that it takes like 2.2 microseconds-ish. Don't quote me on that, but something like that. A short amount of time, but it's fast enough for the neutrinos to actually oscillate between the types. And so they can see this oscillation at the far detector for Minos. And it's this oscillation that they're looking for, and even though they can only correlate 45 events per month, I'm sure they've done more, I'm sure they've done less, but on average 45, 425, not 45, 425, between 4 and 5. And, it's enough to actually prove, and they have proven, that neutrinos do oscillate. And so they're also wondering, some people suspect that there could be a fourth neutrino and a fourth lepton to go along with it, because the electron neutrino goes along with the electron, the tau neutrino goes along with the tau, etc. Standard model doesn't predict any, but it doesn't, but nobody says there can't be more. So people actually suspect that also, but maybe Nova can determine this, or maybe a new generation of physics will be necessary. So and then the neutrinos will interact with the far detector. Obviously, I didn't go to the far detector of the Sudan mine because that's many hundreds of miles away. But they'll actually, interact with that, and then they can send the data. And their timing systems are very accurate, indeed. So they don't have to worry about neutrinos traveling faster than light like they did at CERN. And they actually told me when I went down there, they said, "Hey, don't bump anything, otherwise you'll get neutrinos faster than light." I thought it was a funny joke, at least. Even if some other people in my group didn't get it. It pays to be informed on physics news. Otherwise, you won't understand physicists' jokes. Anyways, that was my tour of the neutrino facility. It was spectacular. It was a lot of fun. And I really enjoyed it, so I'd like to dedicate this video to the people that made that tour possible. So thank you very much, because I had a lot of fun. I forgot to mention one thing, how they actually focus. The last stage of focusing doesn't come from the proton beam. After the proton beam hits the graphite block, the pions and kaons are actually focused by this sort of two large metal funnels that are maybe 3 feet wide. For the larger funnel comes first, and it's 3 feet wide at its largest point, and maybe 6 inches wide at its smallest point, and then the other one is 5 inches wide to fit inside the 6-inch part of the other funnel. So the second funnel is 5 inches wide, and then it gets to about 2.5 to 2 feet wide, at the other side, and they basically put coils around these funnels, and they run 500,000 amps through it. That's right, 500,000 amps, 500,000 amps through these coils, and this actually focuses the beam of pions and kaons coming out of the graphite block, even though they're mostly traveling straight anyways. So that's the last stage of focusing they have in that beam, but I thought that was crazy. 500,000 amps. I don't know how they can possibly get that much power, but they managed to somehow. So that I correct myself. That is the last stage of focusing that the beam receives. So I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed going to Fermilab, although I'm not sure that's possible. It really was a unique experience, and if you can get to a physics lab, I highly recommend you do so, because it was an insane amount of fun. And it's really interesting because there's these neutrino facilities, obviously, like I've said, are mostly underground. There's huge underground caverns and tunnels, but yet the building above ground remains like a small building, smaller, you know, the size of a small house, maybe. So, it's very interesting. So, thanks for watching. Bye.